Here we are again. Welcome back to this edition of Leading Through Unprecedented Times. I'm Tom Murray, your host, and I couldn't be any more excited to have the one and only Jimmy Casas with us today. Jimmy has been with us since the inception of Future Ready. He's done incredible work, been at so many events for us. Not only is this man an incredible best-selling author and speaker, working with school and district leaders. Full disclosure, it's somebody I'm proud to call one of my best friends. Jimmy, how are you today, my man?
I'm doing great. I was just thinking as you were talking, maybe I should just have you introduce me all the time. That was pretty good.
Yeah, don't get too crazy there. Don't get too crazy. So, Jimmy, for those of you that may not know who you are, the work that you do, just a little bit of history about your career and then kind of the work you're doing today.
Yeah, just like many people, Tom, somebody who's very passionate about education. Started my career in Milwaukee Public Schools. That's where I started as a classroom teacher working in the inner city. Took my first principalship at 26, which is crazy when I think about that. That's over 30 years ago. It's kind of scary. And then continued on in that position for 22 years, and then retired. 7 years ago, almost 8, going on almost 8. Tom, holy cow! And have been blessed and currently support educators all across the country, specifically building and district leaders, just in developing and building leadership capacity and how to create high-performing cultures. So blessed in doing that work with a lot of coaching work and presenting work and so forth. But yeah, just super, super, super blessed.
Well, you were with us, Jimmy, at the original kickoff at the White House with President Obama. I can still picture you sitting up there up front on that very first day, and we're able to join us for so many of our institutes, and you led such incredible conversations. And so there's a number of areas I really want to talk through you today. When I think of Jimmy Casas as the professional, not as a close friend, but as a professional, there's a number of areas that come to mind right away, from culture to instructional leadership to, their whole last book on recalibrate, really around mindset and some of those pieces. And would love to dives into some of those things. Now, Jimmy, you get to see a lot around the country. You're constantly with principals, constantly with district level leaders, leading retreats, and just helping people think through. You see so many of the issues out there today. But let's first dive into, if we could, instructional leadership, because I know as former principal myself at both levels and listening, and we had Carm Maring on earlier at another podcast talking about the challenges of leading the day-to-day stuff and all the pieces that principals have to run with being the instructional leader of the building. We both know that sometimes we got that time on our schedule, but we walk in at 7:00 and bam, something hits, and we don't leave that office till 7 p.m. because of the issues that arose and didn't step foot in a single classroom. And so this is something you're working with across the country with school and district leaders. So I'd love to give some just high level thoughts about, I guess, the importance of instructional leadership from that principal lens.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And I think that's an area where, honestly, a lot of leaders, quite frankly, feel guilty about it, right? It's not that they're not trying to, it's not they don't want to, but they literally get sucked into the daily grind, right? They get caught into all the things that are going on in the daily work that they're having to do and the challenges that they're facing. And so they quickly fall back into that management mode. And the truth of it is, Tom, they're good at it too. That's the thing. They're really good at it. And so when you have those to-do lists and you feel like you're just knocking those to-do things off, it makes you feel like, hey, I'm getting a lot of stuff done today, but we're really not moving the big rocks. And we know at the end of the day, we're all held responsible for student achievement, right? And therefore, we have to look at the teaching and learning aspect. But in my experience right now, none of these things are in isolation. I think these things are they kind of intersect quite often. And so what I mean by that, Tom, is one of the areas that I see right away is one of the reasons that principals aren't getting into classrooms is, quite frankly, which is kind of interesting, is they don't think strategically in terms of how do they build a system, right? How do they create a system where they're literally building their capacity to be able to get into these classrooms? That's part of the issue. A lot of principals, quite frankly, right now, for good reasons, they see themselves as servant leaders, right? They have tremendous work ethics. They want to be servant leaders. They feel ultimately responsible for everything that happens in the building. And so therefore they unintentionally create this thing where they're doing everything, right? And that's part of the issue why they can't get in the classrooms. So we have to begin to think a little bit strategically, then how do we build capacity around the people that work with us so we can get in those classrooms? So we do identify some specific areas. Like, number one, we do believe that principals should form a very strong partnership with their building secretary or their building admin assistant. And part of that reason is because that building admin assistant plays a critical role in their scheduling and how they manage the principal's schedule and how they make sure, and I'm going to use the word protect their principal, and to make sure that those principals are getting into those classrooms. And so we have to be really intentional of how we're strategically building the capacity of those secretaries. And in order to do so, that means we have to meet with them on a regular basis. We have to be really intentional about doing that. Secretaries are there to help the principals move the big rocks, but unintentionally sometimes they get also caught into management mode. So that's one layer we see right away. The second layer we see, Tom, is when we talk about instructional leadership is we have to make sure that we're getting those assistant principals involved as well. And that's a huge component as well in terms of, we don't want just the building principal being in classrooms. We want the building principal modeling to their assistant principals the importance and how critical that work is, especially when you think about not only walkthroughs, but what about the observations? What about those summative evaluations that are due always in the spring? And what we don't want is we don't want people scrambling at the last minute to get things done, because now it just seems like we're just checking the box, that we're really not focused on improvement in terms of instructional practices or assessments or student engagement. It's more like, hey, I just got to get through this because I got so many things coming at me. So how are we being really intentional to create that capacity within our assistant principals? And then last but not least, how are we using our building leadership teams as well, especially those department chairs or those grade level team leaders? We want to make sure that they have a voice in this entire process as well in terms of what that looks like. And then we don't want to leave out the instructional coach, or maybe you have a behavior specialist or whatever types of literacy coaches, math coaches, whoever you have. And so what we see, Tom, is that effective leaders right now are doing a really good job of really bringing people to the table who is all going to be a part of this system that we're going to create. And it always starts with the vision of the principal. The building leader has to have a vision. What is ultimately their vision? And one of the things we talk about often is that everybody in the buildings, quite frankly, should be seen as an instructional coach. Everybody was a teacher at some point. Everybody has talents. Everybody can bring something, a voice. They can bring insight. They can bring their talents. So how do we really create this community where everybody sees themselves as an instructional leader? Not just the principal, not just the instructional coach, but every teacher. So if you have 90 staff members, you have 90 instructional coaches right there. And so we have to have a vision. What ultimately are we trying to accomplish? So that's one thing we set down right away. Number two is when we go into walkthroughs, we want to make sure that we're walking to classrooms that we have a purpose. What was the purpose of walking through these classrooms? And we want to be very clear about that. So we need to be clear in those expectations. We don't want teachers wondering, like, what is the principal doing here? Why are they in here? Or we don't want them getting nervous. And so part of what we learn is when we bring those people and give them a voice at the table, then together we can all create look-fors that align with our building goals, our school improvement plan, right? Those big rocks that we're really trying to shift that student achievement. Maybe it is around assessments. Maybe it is around just in terms of homework or grading or whatever it happens to be. But if we're talking about instruction or assessment or even curriculum, is we want to be clear what we're looking for when we go in there. So let me give you an example. So 3 things that honestly, as a company that we really focus on all the time, are really the 3 biggest things that we believe are the most important. And that is, number 1, the culture and climate in which we're creating that classroom. So we're going to really look at relationships, how they're being established, how we're being intentional, those types of things, how are we giving kids a voice, and how do they own their own learning. The second thing we look at is certainly engagement, but what does that look like and what does that actually mean? I mean, we can talk about engagement, but if we don't define what we're looking for when we go in there, then all of a sudden people are confused. Well, I thought the kids were engaged. Well, not really, right? What we mean by engagement is this. That means we see kids having conversation about whatever the objective was for the day and those types of things. And then last but not least, we also obviously look at a lot about assessments, right? Especially those formative assessments. We know that when we go into classrooms, we see a lot of teachers still doing most of the teaching, most of the talking, most of the directing. We want to see more kids involved in those conversations, better questioning, more conversations, more seeing if they can transfer, understand the content they're learning, why they're learning it, what are they going to do with it. We want to see a little bit more of that inquiry model, but we're not quite seeing that to the level we want to often. And again, so these are some of the what we would call the basic fundamentals that people can begin to think about when they begin to create their structures. But that is like a framework that you would want to create. What would that look like and who should you have at the table?
Awesome, Jimmy. Speaking of frameworks, I know you're a huge, just like a Future Ready, you're a big fan of frameworks themselves. And one of the pieces that I've seen you use and talk about, let's get real practical for just a moment for our principals that are listening. I know in your framework that you use around cultivating a community of leaders, you have a number of strategies that are really short, sweet, to the point around what you were just talking about early on and protecting your time, but also making sure that we're in sync with our assistants and in sync with those that are protecting our calendar. You use things like the daily 5, check 5, 30 dive. I've heard you talk about. Give a couple of those just real practical strategies for our principals that they can stay in sync with their admin assistants. So just give a couple of those practical ideas if you would.
Yeah, Tom. And first, I would say, and thank you for sharing that, is the most important thing is we have to understand why frameworks. What's the benefit of a framework? Well, we first of all we want to understand that. And one of the things that we don't really often learn when we're in leadership school is really the importance and how frameworks can help us lead. So we can begin to ask ourselves and kind of almost do a self-assessment. So here would be an example like, well, ask yourself, what framework am I using when I lead? Where am I drawing from? How do I make these decisions? And when we know frameworks, what they do is number one is they do slow us down. And that's really important for leaders. We know how fast paced this job is. And what we see is that leaders are moving so quickly again because they're in management mode, they're in fix it mode, they're moving quickly, they got a lot of issues they have to deal with. But what they don't see, Tom, is they get sloppy. They really do. They get sloppy, which means they're making decisions very quickly. They're not thinking them through. And that, what I mean by sloppy is that decision they make because they're moving so quickly will create what I call that undercurrent in the culture. In other words, it hurts morale, it hurts the culture. It creates some issue that now I have to go back and recover that issue. And that recovery mode is what's exhausting. That's what we see as overwhelming people and really tiring them out and getting them almost fatigued, right? Because they're constantly dealing with these undercurrents. So frameworks certainly slow us down. Number two, they bring clarity. I mean, now everybody's on the same page. We know exactly what we're doing, why we're doing it, when we're going to do it. And we have to have some clear language around that. So that's what's also really important about frameworks. They also allow us to influence people. Influencing people is one of the greatest characteristics and attributes of effective leaders. They have an ability to influence people. But when they're clear with the framework, they stay consistent. And that's important too. So we want to understand why those things are important. Why do we want to have these frameworks in place? So you just mentioned, and you rattled off a couple of those. And one of those we begin to look at, again, when we're looking at building capacity, we're looking at those different tiers. And so we begin to layer the leadership in our schools. So we should always start with the building leader, or excuse me, the building secretary. And so a framework would be, as you just mentioned, number one is every day we have a daily 5, which is real simple, but it's a framework to remind me, to hold me accountable, to do the things I said I was going to do, to keep me consistent, to bring clarity, to slow me down. But it also allows us to be a little vulnerable because we do need help in leading our schools. We can't lead a school all by ourselves. The key is how do we strategically and intentionally build capacity, and how do we truly empower people? So the daily 5 is just a reminder to our secretary as we're checking with them every day religiously without exception, because we need to get ourselves organized. We need to know what's coming up. We need to make sure that we're staying on time to everything. Why is that important? Because we learn from assessments that we do on cultures that one of the biggest frustrations that teachers have is when their principal is unorganized. They don't show up. They're late. And that's really frustrating to staff. And that is a credibility killer. So we want to make sure that our leaders stay on time and stay punctual. You're going to have a really hard time as a leader talking to a teacher about punctuality or a student when you can't even be punctual, right? And so we want to make sure we're modeling that high level of excellence. And so that first daily 5, the check 5 is to simply keep us on pace, to make sure, again, that means we give permission to the secretary to hold us accountable, to open the door, to knock on the door, to pop their head in and say, hey, I'm sorry, but Mr. Murray needs to get to his meeting. And they really keep us on our schedule, because every time we fall off our schedule, now we're not getting to those classrooms. Now we're not getting to our meetings. And when that happens, we also create an issue for somebody else, right? We create an issue for somebody else. We don't want the characteristic of our leadership to be that we're not dependable. That is not good for us. Effective leaders are dependable leaders. And then you had the 30 dive. And that's where we say, again, you have to have a formal meeting, we believe, with your secretary every week, because, again, that secretary keeps you focused. There are a lot of moving parts in leading a school. We got to be thinking out ahead, 1 week, 2 weeks, what's coming up a month from now. I mean, right now, think about it. You're ready to hit May. You better know all the events that are going on, the senior awards assembly, the graduation. If it's elementary school, you've got these end of the year activities going on. You need to stay ahead of all those things So again, so you don't appear that you're unorganized and now people are in scramble mode, because that's going to hurt your culture. And then the last one is just at the end of the day, we always got to make sure we check in for 5 again, just to say, hey, how did they go today? Is there anything we need to clean up? Is there anything we didn't get to? So that was just a simple framework, but we can create frameworks for meetings. We can create frameworks for delegating. We can create frameworks for many, many things in the work that we do, how to build capacity. Because if you don't have a place to draw it from, again, the danger is you're kind of just leaving it to chance. And one of the biggest frameworks we see, Tom, where people really clamp onto and really need a lot of support is how to manage that really complex conversation. So real quick on that one, we do encourage people, when you have to have a conversation with someone who's underperforming, because remember, that's usually the issue that's going to happen, is that they're just not doing their job. We certainly know we have issues that are a little bit more egregious, but that's a whole different kind of conversation, because now you're probably looking at some sort of reprimand, or maybe a suspension, or even a termination or removal from the work. But when we're usually talking about people just not doing their job. So we want to make sure that we have a framework to draw from to keep us consistent. But also remember, if you're a leader of a building and you have APs, I know not everybody does, but if you do, you don't want different people managing conversations differently. Again, that's going to create issues for us. But if everybody had a framework to draw from, you'd get a much better result. And plus, the one thing I forgot to mention earlier about the benefits of framework is when you bring all that clarity and consistency, what people love about them is you still have a lot of autonomy within that framework. We're not trying to make everybody look and sound the same, but it does protect all of us that we're drawing it from somewhere. So in a complex conversation, we want to do a quick wellness check before we start the conversation. Once we do the wellness check, like, how are you doing? How are things going? I'm worried about you. What's going on, those types of things. Then we want to validate that with a thank you. I appreciate that. That makes me feel better. I appreciate you can trust me with that. Then we want to go into inquiry mode, because what we learn from inquiry mode is we want to stay in question mode. We got to see ourselves as coaches and teachers, not as fixers. And we have to build our capacity. And again, to get out of fix it mode, we stay in question mode, but we also don't want to misdiagnose things. Again, if you move too quickly, you could actually misdiagnose it and create a bigger issue. So we're going to do a wellness check. We're going to validate. We're going to stay in inquiry mode. And then we got to be very upfront about our expectations. In other words, we can't just let people behave however they want to behave. Once we give the expectations, then we want to give people some processing time. That means that's when we are clear, we walk away, we give them some time to think through that. And then we always circle back, Tom, because that's really, really important when it comes to building culture. When we give people our time and we care enough to follow back up, we see a better result in that relationship.
Yeah, awesome conversation and some great practical takeaways on especially gaining some of our time back to be instructional leaders, to be able to get into classrooms, give some feedback, because ultimately it's why we're there. And let's talk culture for a few minutes. And obviously your bestseller Culturize has sold a gazillion copies and is out there, and you had your different tenets around culture. And one of the things I know you've been talking a lot about more recently, and I think you hit and recalibrate as well, is really seeing culture through the eyes of others. As building principals and district leaders are really starting to wrap up their school year in the next number of weeks. Reflect a little bit, if you could, about what are some practical ways that school and district leaders can actually do that, see culture through the eyes of others, and what can principals do to get a real accurate feel for where people are at so that they can move things forward.
Yeah, that's again, Tom. A lot of those cross over, right? And I appreciate that as well. And part of the reason is because again, we only see what we see. A lot of things we see that are on the surface. What we don't see is that subculture beneath there, or that undercurrent. And what we have to understand is, again, leaders cannot be leading these organizations by themselves. But again, they're not in isolation. We have to build relationships. We have to pour into our people. We have to have empathy. We have to have compassion. We've got to build trust. If we can't do those things, it's going to be really hard for people to share with us what they see if they don't trust. But if we can begin to pour into people and be very strategic, but also very transparent and sincere about that, then we can ask them for their help. I still believe the four most powerful words in leadership are, I need your help. And what we need their help with is asking them to help us see what we don't see. So before a leader makes a decision, before a leader implements something, again, we're not saying that a leader can ever do things and make decisions in isolation, but you also want to get into the practice of at times going to people and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. And if I were to do this, Tom, what undercurrent could that possibly create? And if we spent more time doing that, we'd avoid a lot of undercurrents that are hurting our culture, that's hurting our morale. We want to, if we're going to talk about giving people voice, if we're going to talk about building capacity, that's great, but don't tell me, show me how you're doing that. So we know that one-on-one times with people, or sitting down with them and saying, hey, I need your help, here's something, if we're going to do this, what undercurrents would that create for me? That is seeing it through their eyes. Because here's what we know. When superintendents make decisions, and sometimes they have to make very quick decisions, and we understand that, but we also see this: if they would have just slowed down and they would have went to their principals and said, principals, here's my situation. Here's what I'm dealing with. I'm going to have to make a decision on this. And here's what I'm thinking about doing. Here's why I'm thinking about doing it. But if I do this, what undercurrents would this create for me? The principal has a different lens. They are at a different level of leadership, that they're going to see things that the superintendent doesn't see. And if the superintendent would take time to do that, it would help them avoid a lot of that stress and a lot of those undercurrents where they get beat up pretty badly. And they could have avoided that because the principals could see it coming. See, the principals can always see the undercurrents the superintendent's making, but ironically, teachers therefore also see the undercurrents the principals are creating, and students always see the undercurrents that teachers are creating. And if every level, district office, superintendent, or principal in building and classroom, were to slow down and see the culture through the eyes of others by simply bringing them to the table and saying, here's what I'm thinking about doing, or here's the dilemma I have, and I need your help. But if we were to do this, what undercurrent would we create? We would avoid a ton of undercurrents, and therefore, quite frankly, we'd be in a better place. We wouldn't be as beat up. We'd have more time to get into those classrooms, more time to invest in that school improvement plan, to do the big rocks, to do the strategic plan, the school improvement plan. But we're getting stuck in this minutia because we're creating a lot of undercurrents because we're not being more strategic. And that's why seeing the culture through the eyes of others is a game changer, in my opinion.
Always so insightful, my friend. Always practical as well. Appreciate that. So as we wind down the weeks here, and some depending on where they are in the country, wrapping up in the next couple of days, next couple of weeks to wrap up their school year. Talk to principals about ways that they can finish strong this year. Strategies or things that you'd recommend to end in a really solid way. We know from I love the work of Dan Pink. His book When talks about the importance of certain timelines and when things happen, and how we kick off, how we begin, the importance of midpoints, but he also talks about the importance of ending and closing things out. And so speak to principals, if you would, if you were wrapping up a school year, what might be some things you might do to make us end real strong?
Yeah, that's the biggest challenge, right, Tom? Because right now principals are closing a school year, but they're also opening up a school year, right? And that's why this time of the year is very, very hectic for them. I mean, they're hiring, they're finalizing schedules, they're finalizing their evaluations. They probably have testing going on in their buildings, not to mention a bazillion events that are going on, and those are important, right, in terms of building culture. So certainly we want to keep celebrating, right? We certainly want to celebrate accomplishments. We still want to celebrate people. We want to celebrate all these things. But I think sometimes we need to be a little strategic in that. So certainly, again, I'm a believer you bring people together. We could be a little bit more strategic in identifying, hey, if we look back at the last year, if we look back to August, and again, if we were being strategic and kind of keeping a timeline on the year, but if we ask people, let's think about all the things that you personally have accomplished. How about your grade level? How about your department? How about our team? How about our staff? What we could do is be very strategic and begin to show people, look how much we've actually done this year. We know there's always going to be more to do, right? But if we're not slowing down and being intentional and realizing, look how far we've come, we've got to show people that we're moving the needle. We got to show people that we're actually growing and really accomplishing those things that we set out to accomplish. But if we're not taking time to be strategic in that, we'll kind of miss it. We'll go right by it, and we'll think we're just in the grind all the time. So definitely one thing is to be a little strategic with your staff. Take some time to identify what are the things that we actually have accomplished this year. Let's go back and revisit. That's one thing. Number two, I think it's always important to go back and reassess our own values. Are we living our values that we have? Number one, do we even remember what they were? Let's go back and talk about those again. I think every year we should be going back and revisiting our values because those values are so critical in our behavior. And remember, if culture is about behavior, which I believe it is, then we want to make sure we're always being consistent and authentic, and we're actually, what I say, living the words that are on the wall. Look around your building and see what are the words on the wall. And the question is this: do the behaviors of the adults in the building actually match those words? And if not, well, it is time to, right, Tom, recalibrate a little bit. And that's really what we need to do because this job is exhausting. It is tiring. So again, we want to slow down, be very intentional about that. And the last thing I would say is this is, again, if I don't want to just do it at the end of the year. And that's one thing I would say is I would identify the things that we're doing at the end of the year and ask ourselves this: is this something that has to wait to the end of the year? Or is this something that could be done at another part of the year? Or more importantly, is this something we should have been doing all year long? And that an example of that, Tom, would be exit interviews. I'm always amazed that we're still doing exit interviews. How about we do stay interviews? And we should be doing stay interviews all year long, right? I've always thought that. Well, I taught for 30 years, and finally somebody sat down with me to ask me my opinion after 30 years. I wish you would have asked me after year one, after year two, after year three, right? Because I could help you avoid a lot of undercurrents. And so we want to see, again, those interviews are really critical in the work that we're doing. It is still the joy of the work. And there is nothing people, in my opinion, that they appreciate more than someone who gives them their time. Tom, before we got on the start of this call, you said to me, I reach out to them every day. And you know why you do that? Because it matters. Because when people know that you take the time for them, there isn't anything more that says you care more than that. So good for you, buddy. Keep doing it.
Hey, back at you. And we're starting to run out of time here, but you mentioned the word hiring, and I know that's also some work you've been doing, working with district level personnel and principals on the hiring process. If I were to give you a minute to talk about, and I know we can't do it justice in a minute, but you can be really concise. As principals and district leaders are hiring today, maybe you're listening to this podcast and you're heading to an interview right there, right now. Give about a minute of advice about, if you're walking into an interview, just core components, most important pieces, things that they should consider in the next minute around hiring. Off the top of your head, go.
As you're the interviewee or I'm the interviewer?
If you're the interviewer, like going to hire people.
Yeah. So again, the first thing we would say, Tom, is what framework are we using, right? And that's what's really important. So number one, obviously the hiring framework, you want some sort of process that goes through that. What does that look like? So the thing to always remember is set people up for success. The more information we can give people that are coming in, the mindset is this: somebody's not getting the job. And when they don't get the job, the question is this: what are they saying about you? And what are they saying about their experience? This is all about creating experiences for people, because somebody's not going to get the job, but you want them leaving wishing they would have gotten the job. So we want to be very intentional, providing as much information, set them up for success. If you're hiring for teachers, I'm a big believer that you should always have a teacher offer a lesson before you hire them. I want to see that teacher teach. We know people can interview very well, but I don't care about that. I want to see what they do in a classroom in front of children. So always find time to do that. The fourth thing I would say is this: you want to make sure you're training an interview committee. How do you select the people? Make sure you train them. That's really important because, again, they don't know. Questions. Make sure you're creating new questions every time. And why did you ask the question? What's the look for you were hoping to get? And finally, at the end, I would not rank the candidates. I'm a big believer is that we should never rank candidates. I believe principals hire teachers. I believe principals create a system where teachers feel that they have a honest, authentic voice, but teachers should not be hiring teachers. Principals should be hiring teachers. And if you have a process and it's clear from the very beginning, then we should always end up with the same candidate if we followed a process and it was effective. And last but not least, never hire someone without doing reference checks. That's what I would say. And when you hire those individuals, remember, they want to be great. So my question is, how are you going to onboard these people? It isn't over when you hire them. You got to keep onboarding them, because they, my friends, are your greatest recruiters that you have in your building. And if you're struggling with teacher retention, then I'd be looking at how you're actually growing and developing your people.
Absolutely. And we'll say hiring great people is the most important job of those that are leading, because that impact is, 30, 35 years worth down the road. Jimmy, if folks want to check out more of your work, where can they find it?
Always at jimmycasas.com is the easiest way to go. You can find everything you need there. So I appreciate it, Tom. Thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you today. Always just good catching up. And it's a good opportunity for me to keep this fresh up here as well. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. So I'm going to give you one final question that I love to
Uh-oh.
ask for everybody. Now that you started to wrap up the podcast, by the way, with all the struggles that our superintendents, our principals are facing across the board, everything that's political, things in the newspaper, just the pressures of all the things you listed, all the events, all the schedules, minimal family time, it seems. From the heart, give me one piece of advice for principals, for superintendents, no matter where they're leading from, moving forward as they wrap up this year. Just one piece of advice you've got for our leaders across the country.
Slow down. Slow down and focus on the abundance of blessings that we have, because it's still the greatest job there is. And there's always going to be issues with the work. We know that. But there are so many more blessings that are coming out of the work that they're doing every day. And we need people bringing their very best selves. We're not saying they're going to be perfect. We're not saying they're going to be 100% every day. but you got to walk in with the belief and the mindset that today is a day again that you're going to make a difference, that you can still change the trajectory of a life of a child on any given day. Because if you don't believe that, we're already in trouble, right? If you think about that. So I think mindset is huge, but it's that mindset that truly believes that I can truly still make a difference. And if you are struggling with that belief, then I always recommend people then just go back and sit in the interview chair, because when you got hired, that was the very best version of you. And I believe what you said in that day was sincere, genuine, authentic. And the truth of the matter is that person is still inside you. You just got to go recalibrate it.
That right there is a perfect place to end. Jimmy, on behalf of Future Ready, thank you for your support over the years, all the work that you've done, all the work you've led for Future Ready Schools. You've been such a vital part of it since inception. So that is Jimmy Casas, everyone. Jimmy, thanks for your time today.
Appreciate it, buddy.